Welcome to this week's episode of Nutrition Science Bites. And today we're talking with Cassandra Nikodijevic, and she is a newly graduated PhD candidate. Well, you're not a candidate anymore. Congratulations, Dr. Cassandra. That's very big news indeed.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you for that. And thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure. And I want to point out that your PhD was on nuts and supported by the Nuts for Life, who are supporting our chat today. So, can you tell me first up then, what was your PhD about?
Yeah, good place to start. So I guess trying to keep it in simple terms, my PhD was really looking at why nuts aren't associated with increased body weight, given they are high in kilojoules. So I was looking specifically at some energy regulating mechanisms, so different reasons that might explain why nuts aren't associated with increased body weight or weight gain. And then the second part of my PhD was really looking at, well, how can we get consumers to eat nuts more regularly, kind of dispel that body weight myth. And one of the avenues I explored was looking at nutrition labels and seeing if we can adjust the kilojoule content of nuts and other products that contain nuts to more accurately reflect the kilojoules that our body actually absorbs, because that's one of the
Yes.
mechanisms. And we'll get
Yeah.
into that in a minute, I'm sure.
Yeah, we will. And I should have mentioned, Cassandra, that you're also an accredited practicing dietitian and you did your PhD down there at Wollongong. But I think
Yes.
the issue you've raised already is something that we did talk about in another podcast we'd done about nuts, is that when you talk to people, most people do think that nuts make you gain weight. And I really do think that's news to most people, in fact, that the systematic review of studies says, people who eat nuts do not suddenly start gaining weight. And I think that's good news, particularly given that, nuts are really a nutritional powerhouse, being the latest buzzword, source of plant-based protein. So they're high in
Yeah.
protein, but I don't think people realize that they're actually really high in fats and contain that range of nutrients, everything from magnesium, iron, zinc, some of them even selenium, and as well as mostly being healthy fats. So, um, did you look at the literature in regard to weight gain and eating nuts as well?
Yeah, so this is, I suppose, where my research that I did in my PhD kind of crosses over with previous research I did in my honours, because in my honours research, I was also looking at nut consumption in Australia and relationship with body weight. So I have had a good read of some of that literature you've been speaking about. And yeah, we do hear of consumers and even health professionals, reporting that the high fat content of nuts is like a cause for concern when it comes to eating nuts and the impacts that might have on body weight. But as you said, there's really strong evidence, systematic reviews, randomized controlled trials that actually show that eating nuts regularly as part of a healthy diet is not going to cause weight gain. And it's perfectly fine to include that handful of nuts every day. Um, and yeah, not worry about gaining weight and you know even including nuts in a potentially weight loss diet or weight maintenance diet.
Well, you know
Um,
what? I think
yeah.
a lot of people are immediately and go, I've heard enough. I'm off to the shops to get myself some nuts
Yeah,
because I think for a
that's
lot
the
of
goal.
people, yeah, I think for a lot of people it's been a guilty pleasure. They really love nuts, but they don't really want to eat them out in public because, people think that you shouldn't be eating nuts. And in fact, I would say that there are many GPs who think you shouldn't eat nuts. So for all our GP listeners, you do not need to tell people they must not eat nuts if they're trying to improve their weight related health. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your PhD then? Because you mentioned some very big words there about metabolizable energy, and I think again some people go, "Oh, my brain hurts." So, what's metabolizable energy, and why is that a thing that you have to talk about when you're talking about nuts and digestion?
Yeah. All right. So let's start with, I guess, defining metabolizable energy.
Great.
So the definition is the energy that is available to the body for absorption. So nuts are a great example to talk about metabolizable energy. So in a handful of nuts, let's say we're talking about mixed nuts or almonds or macadamias or whatever, there might be somewhere between, 800, 700, 800 kilojoules in that 30-gram portion of nuts. But when we eat nuts, chew them, break them down, they go through the digestive tract. Not all of the energy is available to the body. So some of the energy or some of the fats are kind of encapsulated and trapped within cell walls. And that energy remains in the cell walls. It's inaccessible to the body during digestion. And it means that that energy is actually excreted when we go to the bathroom. So it's not that the, metabolizable energy is a different, like I guess it's different, but what I'm trying to say is that
It's
the energy
stuck.
is still there,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's stuck and we can't access all of it.
Yeah, so that kind of sounds to me like that's actually, well, some people might go, oh no, it's been wasted. But actually, it's a positive thing in the sense that those fibers that are, likely part of the cells as well, as part of that excreted bit of energy, it actually means they're not as high in calories or kilojoules as what
Yeah,
people thought they were, even though we've been reading about a certain amount of energy on the nutrition label. It's actually not as high as that.
yeah, and that's exactly right. So that kind of gives us one extra reason why we should be eating nuts and not be worried about the potential for weight gain because we're not even getting all of those kilojoules.
Can I ask you, is it a very big percent? So, because again, now I'm thinking people out there going, woohoo, there's no kilojoules, no energy in nuts, so I can eat as much as I want. So, but can you give us a bit of an idea? Like, is it 5%, 25%, 95%? What kind of difference is there between what we see on the nutrition label versus the energy that's excreted?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So let's jump into that now. It does vary based on the nut type as well. So I guess to give a short answer, the amount of metabolizable energy could be up to 26% lower
Wow.
than the total energy. But as I said, that depends on the nut type. So for something like almonds, that's where we're seeing that higher range of 26% lower than the total energy. For something like cashews, it's around 14% lower. Walnuts were found to be 22% lower, and then pistachios only around 5% lower. So quite a
Right.
range. And
Yeah.
it's important to know that it's not always 30% or 50% lower. There is actually
Yeah.
differences.
So, Cassandra, I'm thinking, why does it vary? Is it something about the fiber content or the fat type or the way it's actually put together inside those cells? Did you get any insights into why that's because that's a big range, isn't it? From 26% down to 5%?
Yep, yep. Um, this wasn't something I really looked at as to why there's differences between nut types, but I do know it is related to that fibrous structure. So I
Right.
would imagine that the differences in fat content, fiber content, some nuts are a bit harder and some are softer. That might have something to do with it, but I can't 100% say what the reason is yet.
That kind of makes sense to me, though. Yeah, because you know yourself, if you
Yeah.
chew on an almond versus a softer nut, yeah, it's a lot different. So it likely is a difference in the fiber. But the other thing it tells me is that's another reason to eat also a range of nuts because whatever the mix of fibers, nutrients, and other types of minerals that are in there, you may as well get the benefit of all of them. So how do nuts then? Are there any other metabolic effects that come from eating nuts?
Yeah. So I suppose if we think of metabolism as energy intake and energy expenditure. So we've already mentioned the metabolizable energy, which obviously relates to energy intake. Another thing that I explored in my PhD was something called energy compensation.
Hmm.
Now I can define that for you as well, because that's another big word.
Please
Um,
do, yes.
so, so energy compensation um, is basically the amount of energy that is reduced due to the previous intake of a food or beverage. So if I put that in other words and give a bit of an example, so if you're eating nuts as a snack at morning tea, for example, some of that energy might be compensated for at the next meal, so at lunch, by you like unintentionally eating less food or less energy at that lunch meal.
That kind of makes sense because, and I'm like a good example of that. So I pack a lunchbox and take it to work, and I always pack a container of nuts, and I like to have that as a snack because that will tide me to lunch. And
Yeah,
if you're
they're
really
really
busy at
satiating.
work,
Hey,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So, but what you're telling me is that me eating nuts, then I'm probably actually not going to eat as much because I've had that pretty energy nutrient dense snack then. So, and that's what is that correct? That's what the research shows that, you eat nuts, you don't have to worry, oh no, and this probably fits with the research on why people don't gain weight by eating
yeah.
having nuts particularly is because your appetite then goes, oh, you don't need quite as much because you already had that snack so you're already satiated or satisfied.
Yeah, so I guess to put it in other words, it really helps you to regulate your appetite throughout the day. They are really satiating, high in those good fats as well as protein and fiber. So we know those nutrients in particular can help contribute to that feeling of fullness and keeping you feeling fuller for longer. So yeah, I think that's all related. And as you said, one of the reasons why regular nut consumers, don't gain weight because they are just, feeling full and not eating larger meals afterwards.
I think that's really important for one of the issues you said right at the start. People are scared about eating nuts. So to me, that's kind of reassuring, is that our body is mostly smarter than us. And it's actually making that micro adjustment in our total energy intake when we've eaten the nuts. But the other thing I want to say is I actually think it also shows then that nuts are a good snack for super busy people because, um, it does tide you over to that meal. So, but are there any other phytonutrients in nuts? Like we've talked about, the healthy types of fats. You've talked about the combination of fibers that mean that it leads to this concept of the metabolizable energy. But what about other other nutrients? We hear about minerals, like iron, zinc, magnesium. But is there anything else in nuts?
Yeah, so this again wasn't really a focus of my research. I know generally, as you've mentioned, a variety of nuts have different types of nutrients as well. So if you think of selenium in Brazil nuts, the good fats in all nuts, vitamin E and zinc, fiber, of course, protein. Um, in terms of the phytochemicals, again, this is not really my focus area, but I know, resveratrol is in peanuts. Um, Other types of phytochemicals, like your different phenols and flavonoids, are found in different nuts, and that really makes sense, I suppose, because we know that these types of nutrients are generally found in plant foods, and nuts are an excellent example of a great plant food. So, yeah, not surprising. But if I bounce that question back to you, uh, do you know of any other phytochemicals that are in nuts?
One of the other thing would be around some varieties that contain, some plant sterols, which, helps with cholesterol metabolism. But for a whole range of reasons, all of these small amounts of phytonutrients are what really make them the nutritional powerhouse.
Yeah.
And I think with the switch and big focus on plant based foods, that this really is why a lot of effort, and I think Nuts for Life in particular are going to a lot of effort to address all those misconceptions, of which there are so many when it comes to nuts. And I think the majority of people are going to be super relieved that it's okay to eat nuts on a regular basis. But what I want to ask you about now is, so do do we eat very many nuts? Do Australians eat nuts, for example, or is you know, or is there evidence that we've been avoiding them?
Yeah, you can probably guess the answer to that question, but I will answer it as well. Um, so this was also something that I explored in my honours research. So before I started my PhD, when I was looking at nut consumption in Australia, um, and the short answer is no, Australians are definitely not eating enough nuts. And I think the average was just under 5 grams per day. So
Five
falling
grams?
way
That's
short of
nothing.
that 30-gram target. Yeah, exactly. I know. Yeah. So we've got a bit of work to do. And I think one of the key things that we do need to tell consumers is that it is, you know, fine and actually recommended to be eating that 30 grams every day and not be scared of weight gain or, the high fat content of nuts. So, yeah.
So one of the things though is that, I imagine not everybody eats nuts, so maybe the average in the nut eaters is a little bit higher than that. But I think the other thing too is that there's probably some people who are periodic nut eaters.
Yeah.
So maybe that, it's not that on average they have 5 grams of nuts per day. I think that would be actually really hard to do that. That'd probably be like having maybe one or two max, macadamia nuts maybe, or a teaspoon of peanuts. I don't think too many people would restrain themselves to a teaspoon of peanuts. So, is that one of the issues? Did you notice anything in that honors project around our patterns of eating nuts? Like, how do Australians like to eat their nuts?
Yeah. So if I backtrack a bit and explain how my honours research started. So I looked at nut consumption in Australia, but before I started my honours research, the estimations for nut consumption in Australia were just based on whole nuts. So, your handful of peanuts, mixed nuts, or something like that. And what I wanted to do in my honours research was account for all the sources of nuts. So, not only nuts that we might have as a snack, but the nuts that are in things like satay sauce, pestos, muesli
Mm,
bars, breakfast cereals, because they previously weren't accounted for. So
right.
to do that, I developed a nut database that detailed the nut type and content of all of the foods that were reported in our 2011 to 13 Australian Health Survey,
Wow.
just so we can a bit more accurately estimate nut consumption in Australia rather than just looking at like whole nut consumption. So to answer your next question about where nut intake is coming from, um, we know that I think it's about 40% of nuts were being consumed on their own as a snack,
Mm.
and about a quarter of nut intake was coming from those nut containing products, so your breakfast cereals and muesli bars and things like that.
And the other percent was just teeny weeny in your satay sauce and things like that, presumably then.
Yeah, so the rest of the percentage was coming from nuts that were being added to salads and stir fries and things like that. So I
All right.
think it was
Okay.
40% of nuts being consumed on their own as a snack, 25% coming from those nut containing products like your
Yeah.
cereals and muesli bars and pestos and things like that. And then my maths is right, 40, 65, 35%. Yeah, that sounds about right. That remaining 35% was nuts that were being
Okay.
added to stir
All
fries
right.
and salads and,
Now,
morning porridge and things like that.
now this is a very geeky question, but I've got to ask you, just going back then, when we said that the average intake in Australia was 5 grams, was that split across all of those categories? Or was that 5 grams of the whole nuts?
that's split across all those categories. So there were some
Wow.
consumers who might just be having a drumstick with the, peanuts on top.
Yeah.
So that's probably why you're seeing such a small amount, because people aren't
Wow.
having nuts or are only having a small amount of nuts in
You
nut
know, that
containing products.
that sort of tells me that it's really not on our radar as a food group. So I think, like with the switch to plant-based foods, this really does give people new information about it's okay to include nuts. I think one of the challenges, Cassandra, though, will be if you live in a household where somebody has a nut allergy. And,
Yeah.
like I have a niece and a nephew who actually have peanut anaphylaxis. And um, there are some tree nuts that each of them, like avoid or can't have, but there are nuts that they can have. And I've got a friend who has peanut anaphylaxis. So
Wow.
with my friend and with my relatives, they have their nuts when those young people are not in the house or when they go
Yeah.
out as a way of getting their nuts. So I think it's a disadvantage. There's more challenges. So, if there's people with nut anaphylaxis, we're not saying you eat nuts, allergy overrides all. But the majority of Australians don't have nut allergy. So, here's a license to go out there and boost your nut intake. But I think that's another good point is all the different ways in which you get nuts. And Cassandra, it makes me think of one of the key things that I do. And we've got this recipe actually on our No Money, No Time website. I make a thing called salad crunch. It's just
Okay.
it's especially good if you've got a loaf of whole grain bread because that's then a bit nutty and you think, oh, that's going to go off. No, no, just break it all up into chunky crumbs on an
Yeah.
oven tray, and this works well when you're warming up the oven to cook something else. Any nuts or seeds, sometimes people have got little packets, little bits and that, and put them on the tray, and it only needs about 10 minutes depending on your oven temperature. And then that dried out mix, put in a container, sprinkle it over. It's really nice just over boring old iceberg lettuce, but you can actually sprinkle it over any kind of meal. But I just call it salad crunch, and it makes lettuce more interesting. And you can add a squirt of mayonnaise or anything else you want, but it's just really easy way to make an interesting salad, basically. So that now counts as your nut serve.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I'm going to have to try that. Like anything to make iceberg
Yeah.
lettuce a bit more exciting.
Yeah, we've got a recipe on No Money, No Time. So can you tell me now about like the rest of your PhD? But first of all, I want to know, like that sounded like a huge amount of work, really doing the detective work on the ways in which Australians eat their nuts. Did you come back and use that database again? Because that sounds like you went to a lot of trouble.
Yes, it was a lot of effort and it was very useful in the next study in my PhD. So I'm very glad I did that investigative work prior.
Okay,
Um,
so how did you take that detective work and what did you do in the next study then?
yeah, so the nut database that I mentioned earlier that I developed in my honours research also came back in my PhD. And the first thing I did was once I had learnt the metabolizable energy of different nut types, so almonds being about 26% lower, for example, I added those metabolizable energy values to that nut database to make it a bit more well rounded. And then I reapplied that updated nut database to the 2011 to 13 Australian Health Survey. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to know, well, if we now know that metabolizable energy of nuts is lower than the total energy that's contained in nuts, is that actually going to make a difference when we're estimating energy intake in people's diets? So I compared the current system of just saying, okay, this is the
Yep.
energy in nuts, this is how much you're getting, compared that to the metabolizable energy values, which are a little bit lower, and found that it does significantly impact our estimations of energy intake coming from
Oh,
nuts.
right. Oh, right. Okay. So that's actually really important. So basically you subtracted off that energy that's lost that because of the metabolizable
Yep.
energy component and found that the nut eaters then had significantly lower energy from what you would have estimated based on looking at the food labels, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And probably important to note that I was just looking at energy intake from nuts, so not looking at the whole diet.
But I think that is then you've done like the scientific work to provide another mechanism for those observational studies that said, hey, look at this, the nut eaters aren't gaining lots and lots of weight like we've been led to believe if you eat nuts. So you've actually provided a rationale. This metabolizable energy at that population level is having an effect.
Yeah, I certainly think it plays a role like that, along with the energy compensation and, you know, appetite regulation that we mentioned before. Um, they both certainly play a role in managing your body weight.
Okay, so now I have to ask you, after doing a whole PhD and your honours research on nuts, did that change the way or the amount of nuts that you personally eat?
Yeah, it's really funny when I talk to people about my research and that I've been researching nuts, since 2018, since my honors research. People ask me like, "Oh, are you just obsessed with nuts? Is that why you started researching nuts?" And I'm like, "No, actually, it's probably the other way around. Like I've always enjoyed nuts, but now that I've been researching nuts for quite a few years, I think I love nuts even more, and I do, attempt to eat them more regularly and including that handful of nuts every day. So, yeah, I think it's the other way around. Now that I've done the research and just realized how fantastic they are, I've certainly increased my intake.
You eat more. And what about
Yeah.
variety? Do you have a different types?
I normally just stick to a bag of mixed nuts. Like I've got a few favorites, but I like variety. Um, so yeah, I just stick to a bag of mixed nuts and I don't have to worry about getting those, different nutrients that we were talking about before.
Well, I'm like you. I like mixed nuts. I do have some favorites though. Like I buy them by the 500-gram bag and, portion them out. So when I'm rushing out the door in the morning, I haven't, it's easy to just grab them, throw them in my lunchbox. But um, the mixed nuts I get, they do contain Brazil nuts. But
Yeah.
so I do end up eating Brazil nuts, but I probably wouldn't buy them all by themselves because I reckon you can taste the selenium in them. But I think some of my favorites are like I really love cashews. I really love dry roasted almonds and I really, really love macadamia, as probably most Australians actually do. When I was a kid, we actually had a macadamia farm, and my brother-in-law, he actually worked on a macadamia farm up in Queensland, and it was always heaven to go visit them because from the factory they'd be like given back some of the macadamia chips that couldn't be packaged
Yeah.
up and to use in
Yeah.
cooking. So you'd walk away from their place with a bag of macadamia nuts and use them in cooking. So I really do love them. But one of the other things, that I know people often go, oh, what about um, dry roasted versus roasted? I think it's just important to reiterate. I know we've said this previously, but that they're not appreciably different because the nuts are high in fat. They don't really absorb much fat if they're oil roasted as opposed to dry roasted. I think the biggest nutritional issue is, especially if you've got high blood pressure, is to avoid the ones that have salt added. And there's lots of options at the supermarket, so you can pick the unsalted varieties. And the other one that I think people go, oh, should I buy those activated nuts?
Yeah.
They've been soaked in brine and they're supposed to mimic the germination. Well, I don't know if you've seen the study, Cassandra, but there was a study that actually showed that for some of the minerals, because they've been soaked, you've actually leached some of the minerals out. So that's
Mm.
like whoa, thank goodness we don't have to pay 2 to 3 times the price. We can just stick to the regular
Yeah.
supermarket type ones. You don't have to go for these ones that are promising you all kinds of special bonuses. And so now the last thing I want to ask you, is there any special nutty thing, not eating them by the handful now, nutty thing that you like to make? I've told you about my secret salad crunch that's no longer a secret because we've put the recipe on No Money, No Time. But if there is a particular nutty thing that you like, then we can always add that as a recipe to No Money, No Time as well.
I actually found a recipe. So I love macadamias too. And it's
Yeah.
funny that you mentioned that your family has or had a macadamia farm. Um, Sorry, this is a bit of a side note, but so I've been living in the place where I'm living now for about 3 years, I think. And just over 1 or 2 years ago, I found out that we have a macadamia tree in the backyard.
Right.
And I've tried picking them and opening them, but they've got such a hard
Yep.
exterior. It's
You need a
really
hammer
difficult to open. I was going to
or
say,
a
do you have any
brick.
tips on how to open them? Because I've tried hammer, and unfortunately, the nut itself splits in half as well. Um, but yeah, I just thought that was so funny. I lived in this place for a year and didn't realize I had a macadamia tree in the yard, and then because I
I'm
loved
going to
macadamias
ask
so
my
much,
my brother-in-law for you. So it wasn't their farm, unfortunately, but I will ask if there's any tricky way. But like we had a macadamia tree when I was growing up, and I'm sure it was either the brick or the hammer for them because
yeah,
they're so
yeah,
hard.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um, so sorry, just to come back to answer your question. So I found in the Healthy Food Guide magazine, they have a recipe for a macadamia and blueberry oat slice thing. And blueberries are
sounds
another
yum.
food I love as well. So I thought this is something I've got to try. And it's just beautiful, sweet, crunchy, just that, nice little sweet snack to satisfy your cravings. So that's something that I really like.
Sounds like that puts you in snack heaven. Well, I
Yeah.
think in summary, Cassandra, we can say that there will be a lot of Australians cheering for you and your PhD because now they can drop the guilt, expand the variety and the regularity with which they eat nuts, and know that absolutely it's not going to mean that they gain weight. So we can bust that myth absolutely on the head. And
Yeah.
congratulations again on becoming Dr. Cassandra through all of your dedication to the research. And a final thanks to Nuts for Life for supporting this episode of the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Claire.